thank you for coming. And the purpose of today is really so that we can hear about what all of our friends and colleagues are working on in the wildfire space, whether they're in management, policy, academia, or research. And so without further ado, I'll just give us a quick 10-minute intro, and then we'll start with our panelists to hear about different national initiatives that are happening to coordinate efforts. So the session is the Wicked Wildfire Problem, a year of innovation and action to reduce negative impacts from wildfire. And so before we dive into thinking about all of our coordinated efforts, we need to get on the same page about what the problem really is in the first place. And the problem is megafires, it's not fires. And so we've actually always had fire and we need fire. And this is well known in fire science. It's also known culturally among practitioners. So here you can see fire over the last 3,000 years in the Western United States. And it's been quite variable. And in fact, we've actually had a deficit in the last 200 years. And so we know that fire's coming, we need fire. And so it's not really about fire as the problem, it's about the fires that have impact. And so these are the fires we call megafires, and they're not new, but they are becoming more common. So here you can see, over the last 200 years, we've had pretty regular fires that have had very negative impacts. This includes everything from area burn to structures lost and lives lost, right? And so when we think about the impacts of fire, we're not just talking about area burned, we're talking about all of these other factors. And so that's really what a megafire is, right? It's a socio-political term for the fires that matter. Big fires matter for smoke. Here you can see the 2020 fire season with smoke from the West Coast traveling all the way across the US and eventually over the Atlantic and into Europe. And we know that proximity matters for infrastructure. So here you can see that actually about over 90% of the fires that happen near homes are started by people. And this is very personal for me as somebody at CU Boulder and the recent aftermath of the Marshall Fire on December 30th of last year. And we know that fast fires matter for lives. So here is the iconic example of the Camp Fire. And just to put this into context, right, the 2018 California Camp Fire traveled 80 football fields in a minute. And if you think about that, it takes 15 minutes for the average wildland fire to be reported in the United States, and about 45 minutes for fire management resources to be deployed to remote, hard to access locations. And so if you think about that in the context of the best resources we have in the world for suppression, they average a production line rate of about 1 kilometer per hour. And so suppression really isn't where the conversation is. The conversation is more about where do we evacuate? What assets need protecting? What do we do to protect them? And how will we better prepare and make resilient communities? And so this is kind of where the conversation has been taking us. And so we realize that the fires that matter are the ones with high fire risk. And this is kind of more of a holistic way of thinking about it, where we go beyond thinking about the hazard or the potential of a fire in wildlands, and we think about how vulnerable and exposed our communities are in the context of the social systems and the technological systems that we have in place, from power lines to housing and buildings. And so really where the problem is at is reducing fire risk, which is called a wicked problem. In complex system science, wicked problems are problems that have varied solutions because there's many different agents, all with authority in different areas, and they all see slightly different solutions. And so what we need going forward to reduce negative impacts is systematic change of the processes that define the interactions of the existing system, which includes hardware or the infrastructure that we've built to support that system, software, or the way that we communicate between things, right? It's not just computer code, it can just be as simple as how we communicate, and people. And so these processes are defined by policies, the rules that govern us, the economics or the markets of exchange, the sociocultural factors or the social constructs under which we adhere. And these are the value systems that we have, as well as the technologies or the tools that we use to navigate within that system. And so last year in 2021, the Keck Institute for Space Studies conducted a study on innovating to the detection and tracking of the fires that matter. And the idea behind this study was to co-produce recommendations for change to fire management of the fires that matter. So shifting away from trying to manage all fires to prioritizing the fires, megafires in particular. And so we really thought, okay, a solution has to be cross-sector and cross-industry. And so we invited leading change agents who have been leading major initiatives in academia, nonprofit, government, and commercial, as well as across science, frontline operators and managers, technologists, strategists, and policymakers to kind of say, what's the real problem here? We all are very smart. We all have solutions. We all have a common goal to reduce the negative impacts. Why are we not able to make progress? And so what happened was we came out of that workshop with some recommendations where this is a very small table, and I put it up here more for people to be able to kind of screenshot it, come back to it. There is a link here at the bottom of the screen for you to go and read it in more depth. But we really wanted to say, what are the common challenges that we're all facing? Independent of our individual solutions, what are the common challenges? What are the solutions to tackling those challenges? And then what are some specific actions we could take collectively as a whole to move towards that collective solution? And so, we thought about this both from an organizational perspective. How do we organize ourselves? We thought about it from a what data and observations do we have available to us perspective. We thought about it from research and development. What do we need to do to start shifting that conversation in research from fire suppression to focusing on the fires that matter? And also, how do we enable management to be able to use what we learn in the process, both socially and ecologically? And then finally, we talked about some common challenges in financing and business, and how do we create a sustainable business model that allows for these solutions to perpetuate through time. So since then, there's actually been a lot of work done by many, right? It's not just KISS, right? We're not the only workshop that's happened recently to plan for a more fiery future. In the research world, NSF and JFSP have been leading their own efforts to set an agenda for the future. There's been a lot of policy movement, both in the executive branch, as well as in Congress and state. There's been mass interagency coordination, and tech and philanthropies have really stepped up and have been making some major efforts to coordinate their efforts. And so the goal of today is really for us to start thinking across all of these different efforts, and are they working together? And so what we really need from today is that policy needs to include the latest in science research and the needs of managers and the capability of technologies. Research needs to focus on supporting managers to implement policies using social, physical, and biological sciences with the latest advances in technologies, such as how to harness the data revolution in the information age. Oops. Managers need to incorporate research and technologies to improve operations in support of those policies. And technologists need to listen to researchers and managers about what would actually add value rather than coming up with solutions on their own, right? So all of us need to work together. And the only way to do that is if we hear from each other what it is we're working on. And so this is really the purpose of today. First speaker is Kendra McLauchlan, the program director in the Ecosystem Science Cluster Division of Environmental Biology in the Directorate for Biological Sciences at the National Science Foundation.
So I am Kendra McLauchlan, and I am here representing the National Science Foundation's efforts in wildland fire science, and in particular, a new wildland fire initiative working group that is made up of approximately 17 program officers from across the six science directorates at the National Science Foundation. So representing the biological sciences, the earth sciences, education, human resources, engineering, math and physical sciences, and social, behavioral, and economic sciences. So we are working to integrate ourselves across the National Science Foundation the way we see a need to be integrated out there in the research community across all of those areas as well. So next slide. So I was just kind of reflecting on the charge here, a year of innovation and action to reduce negative impacts from fires. I think that's a really great idea. I am kind of jumping in here, I guess, on this follow-up to the initial workshop. And it's interesting thinking about this framing in context of a national funding agency like ours, which is functioning purely through giving out awards to researchers and other people. So we don't do anything ourselves. We're not like some of the mission agencies that you'll hear about from in a little bit. So I was reflecting on just the content of the awards that we've made in this area of wildfire or wildland fire in the last year. If you go to the public awards search, there's 187 of these awards. And even though NSF is solidly in the research sector, we also have research that includes education and social science and translational applications, especially in the engineering sciences. So we do kind of touch on those aspects of wildland fire that we all need to think about. And these awards cover multiple disciplines, diverse approaches. Sometimes it's to an early career investigator at a university. You know, sometimes it's coming from a community that's interested in a certain aspect. Sometimes it's large teams of people. So we have a lot of different things going on with these awards. And I put the picture on the right to just remind us that I think from our point of view, to understand megafires and wildfire in general, we need to understand how fire operates in the Earth system really broadly as part of interacting with social systems and the built environment. And so that's going to include some really destructive negative fires, but also good fires, prescribed fires, agricultural fires, fire as a tool, and kind of understanding the full array of these fires, I think is something we're interested in supporting. So next slide. We do have a unique role in wildland fire research. So we are the basic science agency. We do conduct through these awards, fundamental science by the research community. In recent years, we have a variety of convergence research programs. We're getting pretty good at supporting this at the agency that really meaningfully includes social science. So some of the decision-making things that Natasha framed up at the beginning. We have innovative ways to connect with stakeholders and rights holders, including Indigenous people. We have a diverse array of programs and approaches. And every proposal to the National Science Foundation includes specific plans for broader impacts, which includes broadening participation, education, and outreach activities. And then we have started some really nice interagency discussions thinking about potential partnerships with the Forest Service, NASA, the USGS, NOAA, JFSP, international partners. So we're very open and flexible and willing to innovate in that space as well. Okay, so the next slide. I think I mostly was supposed to speak about this kind of year ago. We had this effort called the Wildfire and the Biosphere Innovation Lab. We had that little logo up there. This came out of a bunch of internal NSF conversations we'd had as the result of yet another record-setting wildfire season, the 2020 wildfire season. And this was an effort that came out of that to get some researcher input about priority areas in wildland fire science. So NSF really does look to the research community for those sources of innovation. And we were really interested to hear what people thought were some innovative approaches to wildland fire science in the face of the fire crisis we're experiencing right now. So 85 participants, we think, more or less, came together over 5 days. It was a very rich, very dynamic, very interactive experience, and gave us some of that input. And it was really great to hear. Products are still coming out from that. We do have a website posted with some of the outcomes from that lab, as well as a multi-author manuscript that is articulating fire science priorities, which is currently in review. So that'll be coming out shortly, we think. So the next slide will say, and we heard from the Innovation Lab participants that there are some gaps in current fire-related research at NSF. So convergence research was pointed out as a very high priority by participants. So this is research. I mean, some people might call it a buzzword, but there's a clear definition, which is convergence research involves a problem, a shared problem that is in need of a solution that requires a deep integration of multiple approaches to solve. And so wildland fire is definitely clearly primed for convergence research, and it was perceived there wasn't enough support for this type of work to be conducted currently. NSF does have quite a bit of infrastructure and facilities, and many of those can be modified to support wildland fire data modeling and forecasting more effectively. There was a need for non-academic partnerships, so this workshop is very interesting in that respect. We do have education programs. We have a whole education directorate, so undergraduate, graduate training, postdoctoral fellows, informal learning opportunities. That there was a need seen for convergent professional learning and enhanced public engagement. Dedicated support for Indigenous fire science was also identified as a priority. Again, we have a TCUP program, the Tribal Colleges and Universities program, that we're very interested in developing in this way. And then decision-making under uncertainties and uncertainty quantification. I think I've heard this is a real thing in computer science. I don't know so much about it myself, but uncertainty is a huge part of what needs to be managed during some of these decision-making times. All right, so just 2 more slides. The next one talks a little bit about our next steps that we're seeing at NSF. So again, we have just convened this cross-directorate Wildland Fire Research Standing Committee. We are functioning very effectively across directorates, really exchanging a lot of information, getting some new ideas going at the agency. We're working to just establish a little bit more of a public facing webpage or communication tool to help people find funding opportunities or navigate through the myriad of funding options we have available currently without bringing anything new forward, just helping people find the right opportunity for them, including non-academic folks through like a small business program and things like that. Again, we've had a lot of fun engaging in interagency coordination so far around wildland fire science. I'm seeing some familiar faces on the call here, and we look forward to more of that soon. And then we are looking at some opportunities for new initiatives that enable innovation in the wildland fire science space. Again, without reinventing the wheel or rolling out something new just for its own sake, I think there is a place to carve out some opportunities that are more clearly able to be connected with our amazing research community. And I'll just end. The very last slide shows an example of an opportunity that doesn't say wildfire, it doesn't say wildland fire written all over it. But just last week, this new initiative called Regional Innovation Engines was rolled out by the new directorate, the Technology, Innovation and Partnerships Directorate, the TIP Directorate at NSF. This is a very interesting initiative. I myself have not fully unpacked it yet, but I would strongly suggest that our community, the people on the call today, take a look at new things coming out of NSF with this lens. You know, can we be applying some of these opportunities to the wildland fire situation in front of us today?
For our next speaker, Paul Steblein, who's the wildfire science coordinator with the USGS and works with JFSP.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here to deal with this really important topic. I've been with U.S. Geological Survey for about 5 years, and before that, 25 years in land management and fire management, policy, budget, and actual biological and science centers. And so I come at it with a mixture of both management and science. I'm also been on the board of the Joint Fire Science Program governing board for a few years as well. Last year, we completed our strategic plan, which included assessment of fire science needs. And the link for it is in the presentation, and I can add it to the chat. But we really tried to gain an assessment of what the research needs were. And what I'd like to focus on is some of the aspects of how we are trying to implement that over the next few years. Next slide. Because there are many questions that need to be addressed, many questions. Everybody has different ones, many management needs, many science efforts that are required to do that. And so some of the important aspects of it is no one agency can do it. So there's a heavy partnership aspect to how we're trying to approach things. There is a great deal of uncertainty that you heard about the last speaker. So what I want to touch on is adaptive management or co-production, landscape science support, interagency modeling cooperative, fire science enterprise architecture, and the importance of boundary spanning partnerships. Next slide. Through my management career, adaptive management was a key principle that some applied well and some did not. And it seems very appropriate, considering the complex interacting factors, how important that concept is for fire management, land management, or community management for that matter. And this cycle of assessing the problem, design, implementation, monitoring, evaluating, and adjustment, the inner blue circle, is that adaptive management's cycle. It fits very well with phases or aspects of experimental science and or co-production, which is another term that has come up a lot, where we can use the best science when assessing the problem in developing either the plan for a project or a whole landscape. That's a perfect time to use the best science, do modeling, scenario casting, if you will, and then design how that management program or project will be done. It is a natural and can be set up as a natural experiment. And so the implementation of it takes place working with the managers to design appropriate sampling techniques so that you get research grade data to work with. You can also involve new technology, new sensors, new capabilities of doing that monitoring. And as you continue on implementing, you get to a point where you need to evaluate, use additional analysis of the newly collected data, look to the future, what's working, what's not. You can, again, use modeling as a tool to look at alternatives for the future, and then go through this cycle again. It is not only just for management projects or programs, but I think this is also a model that could work for policy alternatives as well. And one of the last one I think was done in 2014, a quadrennial fire review. It was a 20-year outlook, casting alternative scenarios. And one of the outcomes of that last one is, rather than just put the best experts down, actually use models and really look at pretty broadly different alternative futures and what are the policy and decision points that are along the way, and address such things as, well, how much treatment do we need to do nationally, and where and what kind, to achieve the outcome that we want to see, to be able to live with fire in the landscape and the goals of the cohesive strategy. Next slide. One way to implement this is one of the things that we're seeking to do with our fire science program at USGS. And I think Forest Service has already done this in some respects. But when I was a land manager, I did not have enough staff of the right kind of expertise to deal with all the issues I was facing. And so I reached out, worked with universities, worked with USGS centers and Forest Service and others to really assess what were the issues and how best to tackle that. And it makes a big difference to have a set of experts with local expertise to be able to help in that management planning and implementation. Well, we think that it's so complex now, the tools have gotten so sophisticated, and staffing is always a challenge, that we should be working closer with the land management units and their staff, and have assistance with postdocs or scientists. Social science it has a role here as well. And based on that kind of support, ready access, draw in the national data sets and other sources of information, locally collected data, be able to draw in the hydrologist, a geologist, a climatologist, whoever is needed to address it, and use the appropriate models to help do that kind of adaptive management science cycle.
Paul, I just want to draw your attention to time. I know you have a number of other slides, so I want to allow all the panelists to speak.
Sounds good, thank you. So this is a way then to tap into expertise that's available and better help the land managers. Next slide. One of those is we've been working with the Wildfire Commons, which is an NSF-funded innovation center, and other scientists, and there's a group of willing experts that are interested in establishing an interagency fire and ecological modeling cooperative to make it easier to do the integrated work, to curate the models, to find the data, and have it done more efficiently and more effectively, whether it's national assessments or down to local levels. Next slide. The whole management science society is pretty complicated. So the middle polygon shows the different areas of work we do at USGS. And on the right is fire management and the wildland fire information technology, some of the key stakeholders. Below that, land and species management, and then further down, emergency water. Then there's all kinds of partners on the science and knowledge sharing side. There's also intelligence, community, and security aspects as well. This is a complex social fabric of disciplines, relationships, organizations with many barriers, make it difficult to do integrated science or interagency science. And so enterprise architecture, IT design to foster the innovation and research, integrated research, and then the on-ramp to institutionalized operational use is a critical part. And so that's what one of the things we're looking at is, what does an enterprise architecture look like to support that across science entities and also with the management use of that. Next slide. And then another key aspect, and some of this is already done well, and there's always more that needs to be done, and that's partnership across organizations. And so Wildland Fire Leadership Council has been around for quite a few years, 4 departments, many agencies, states, counties, tribes, local governments, but there's also new ones that have recently become more prominent with fire, like ICAMs. And so one of the new things that needs to take place is those that are trying to address the issue need to be coordinating at the national level. There's others like the Fire Science Exchange Network is great for tying together universities, agencies, scientists, and managers, and fostering the exchange of information. And then the technical setting group, the National Wildfire Coordinating Group, is another good example. But again, we need to find better ways to connecting out with all the sources of science and information and help that is needed to address these issues. And I think the next one's my last slide. Again, there's many complex questions, a lot of people that are, a lot of organizations that are trying to do it. And it's really going to take a suite of different efforts to accomplish that. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm going to jump over to Jeff Rupert.
So I'm Jeff Rupert. I'm the Director of the Office of Wildland Fire in the Department of the Interior. It's a real honor to join y'all today and appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about or I'll try to keep it as short as possible, Federal Wildland Fire Interagency Coordination. You know, just to hit real briefly, Natasha mentioned it, it really resonates strongly with me. I do think, you know, this is a societal level challenge that we're interacting with megafires. And I think that's important. Paul made several references to sort of the complexity of it all. I agree wholeheartedly that this is a complex, wicked problem that we have. And I think that has been fundamentally part of the challenge, is just the complexity and how to have that effective societal level engagement. You know, Natasha asked us to sort of focus on or ask ourselves, you know, what have we learned? And I'll give, at least, you know, sort of from my perspective, a bit of a Midwestern, where I grew up, response to that notion of what do I think I've learned. Over the last few years, from my perspective, from my opinion, I think I've learned that the firefighters that are on the front line, what they've been talking about for many years now, the fire managers, the same thing, land managers, what the fire ecologists have been telling us for decades is that we're on a really bad trajectory with intense, catastrophic wildfire and megafires, and we need to respond. And I think what I've learned is I feel like societally we have crossed a threshold in recent years, and I do feel like we're at a place where there's general acceptance that this is unacceptable and intolerable, and we do have to respond differently to megafires. So with that, I'll jump in. And look, I could talk for a long time about the mature and robust interagency response framework that has, quite frankly, been very efficient and very effective interacting with wildfires, responding to wildfires for many years. And in fact, it's contributed to part of our problem. It's been so effective that fire does not play the role that it traditionally, you know, has in fire adapted ecosystems. Layer climate on top of that, and then you layer expanding interface with people and communities moving into wildlands, and by and large, that's a simple explanation for how we got into the place where we are today, where we have these unacceptable, intolerable impacts to people and values. But instead, I'm going to take a step back and talk about three bodies that I think are important through that lens of federal interagency coordination. That a council, a commission, and a working group that I think looking forward are very well positioned for us to expect that they could have a real impact on how we respond to megafires. The first I'll talk about is the oldest. Paul mentioned it briefly in his presentation, the Wildland Fire Leadership Council. So this council was established in 2002, so it's been around for a while. To give you a sense, so it's persisted across 4 administrations. It's an intergovernmental committee, federal, state, tribal, county, municipal government officials. It's convened by the Secretaries of Interior, Agriculture, Defense, and Homeland Security. It has those 4 federal agency members, 7 non-federal members. WFLIC has a focus on coordinating, informing federal policy. I think one of the most impactful and sort of effective efforts of WFLIC is that it essentially is the voice of the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. The cohesive strategy was developed beginning in 2010. It's essentially a national strategy that identifies 3 primary goals: establishing fire resilient landscapes, fire adapted communities, people, and also establishes the goal of safe and effective response to wildfire. The vision is to safely and effectively extinguish fire when needed, use fire where allowable, and manage natural resources as a nation to live with wildfire. It's an all hands, all lands vision. the cohesive strategy has now persisted across 3 administrations. That's kind of a big deal in sort of a world of policy. And I think it's an important perspective that I'll circle back to at the end. The second group, Wildfire Resilient Interagency Working Group. This group was established last year in 2021. It's a federal interagency working group directed to reduce wildfire risk, restore fire-adapted landscapes, increase fire and climate resilience in communities. The working group is directed to provide a whole of government approach to work closely with the Wildfire Commission, which I'll talk about next, the Wildland Fire Leadership Council, and to pursue an all of government approach to wildfire risk reduction and resilience. And again, I'll circle back in just a couple minutes to why I think that's important. The third group, the Wildfire Mitigation and Management Commission. So the commission fulfills a key provision of the bipartisan infrastructure law, focused on combating the nation's wildfire crisis and improving resilience in America's landscape. The commission is tasked with recommending federal policies and strategies to more effectively prevent, mitigate, suppress, and manage wildland fires, including rehabilitation of land affected from wildfires. It will include representation of federal, state, tribal, county, municipal governments, as well as non-governmental stakeholders from private industry. The commission will deliver, and this is important, this is a take-home point, a report to Congress with practical policy recommendations 1 year from the first meeting. Additionally, the commission is also instructed to outline a strategy to cost effectively meet aerial firefighting equipment needs. Okay, so the commission, 18 non-federal members, 9 federal members. The status of the commission is it was announced, established in December. Members are being selected as we speak. And over the next 4 or 5 weeks, there will be an announcement naming the members of the commission. The commission is expected to meet for the first time this summer, and then that report will be due in 1 year. I'm going to backtrack, just take a half step back and point out, so I mentioned the interagency working group to give you a sense of the composition of that group. So it's a federal working group. It includes 9 federal agencies, so very, very, very senior leadership across 9 full departments. So think the cabinet, as well as a number of White House offices. There are at least 5 White House offices on the interagency working group, and there may be 1 or 2 that are moving in and out of the working group as well. And that's important, and the reason being, so how do these groups overlap or not overlap? Do they interact? Are they all doing the same thing? So here's the context that I'd like to finish with and share with you. So I think, again, through that lens of, at least from my perspective, we've crossed a threshold, a societal threshold where I think we are in a great position to expect that recommendations and solutions are going to be more sort of societally accepted than what the engagement has often felt like, at least from my perspective, in the past. As we look across the groups, I look at the commission. The commission is set up to deliver solutions, practical solutions quickly. 1 year is a relatively short amount of time. That group is reporting directly to Congress. There are real opportunities there in terms of, in addition to the kind of investment that's included in infrastructure now, but to also take us down the road of, you know, identifying and prioritizing investment for real solutions that the commission delivers. The interagency working group, it's important because the interagency working group delivers a very urgent and acute sense of priority. So, you know, I have been working in Interior for right at about 30 years. And I can tell you on a handful of issues with this interagency working group, that sense of priority and expectation has been very impactful. And from my perspective, I have seen fairly substantial decisions and implementation and heavy lifting that has occurred at a more rapid pace than anything I've seen or experienced in my career. So that IWG delivers urgent, acute priority. What does WFLIC do? WFLIC delivers persistent, sustained, durable, focused follow through. Again, that notion of WFLIC has persisted across 4 administrations. The National Cohesive Strategy has persisted across 3 administrations. That's a really big deal. The reality is the pendulum swings. Agendas can change. There are different values that come and go into leadership of the federal government. WFLIC has done a wonderful job of working across administrations. And so the commission delivering solutions short term, IWG providing laser focused priority to implement solutions, and then the WFLIC coming in behind to follow through and help carry that across, you know, quite frankly, decades. I think, you know, we all recognize that it took a century to get here, a century plus to get here. We're not going to solve it in a single year. Realistically, you know, we have a decade or 2 of risk reduction work in front of us at a pretty massive scale to really get out in front of the megafire crisis. And WFLIC sets us up to do that.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And I think that's a perfect lead off to our next speaker, Dr. Rebecca Adler Miserendino, the leader of the Environment and International Teams at Lewis Burke Associates, who's going to talk about how Congress has been thinking about this, the megafire problem.
Thank you. So it's great to be here to speak with you all this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. As Natasha has said, I'm from Lewis Burke Associates. It's a full service government relations firm that works primarily with universities, scientific societies, and other science focused institutions. Many of whom have great interest in addressing wildfires through research and technological innovation. So today, it was great to hear from individuals from federal agencies, but no discussion of US federal policy is really complete without a discussion of what's happening with the legislative branch. So today, the multi-trillion-dollar questions that I have to address for you today are: 1, will Congress actually meet the moment when it comes to addressing increasingly frequent and severe wildfires? And the second question, what can we do as a community to help pass legislation that will actually help lead to some progress in reducing the risk of wildfires broadly? So to the first question, since last January, there have been 237 pieces of legislation introduced in Congress that address wildfires to different degrees. And most of these bills, unsurprisingly, have not and will not become law. Nonetheless, there are some broad trends that one can see by looking at what actually has been introduced among these bills that may help inform a policy or advocacy priorities over the near, medium, and long terms. So to date, much of the legislation that's been introduced during the 117th Congress, which is our current Congress, have focused on strengthening the firefighting workforce, improving working conditions and compensations for first responders, and providing funds or programmatic guidance to departments and agencies to make incremental improvements to existing technologies or practices through purchasing of additional equipment or through small investments to improve data sharing practices. Much of this has been accomplished through or championed through the lens of addressing climate change. This characterizes much of what was passed in November in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is also known as the bipartisan infrastructure package that Paul referred to just a couple minutes ago, which incorporated aspects of a legislation that had been introduced by several key wildfire champions in Congress. This $1.2 trillion package, which included $550 billion in new spending, included approximately $3.3 billion of funding to address wildfires, which is just over 0.5% of the overall package, and of which $600 million was primarily to address personnel and workforce related challenges for firefighters. The remaining $2.7 billion focused on a whole bunch of smaller programs to support equipment upgrades, land management activities, and a very small portion to support research and research-related tools and other innovation. So one of those programs we've heard a lot about, $20 million to support the Joint Fire Science Program, $100 million to support NOAA's Fire Weather Testbed Program, for example, $1 billion towards FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities Program. And then it also established this commission that Paul spoke about, so I will not go into detail about. Well, this funding was very significant and should be considered a win for the wildfire community, and it will support very important work. The total funding provided is entirely insufficient to address increasing risk of megafires in the United States, even in combination with increased wildfire-related accounts to the agencies through the fiscal year 2022 appropriations bill. Although the administration has emphasized the importance of enhanced interagency coordination to facilitate or to continue the government-wide approach to addressing wildfires as a part of the climate change agenda and otherwise, there has not been significant success in supporting cross-cutting wildfire-related research and innovation agenda, or to develop unified, consistent approaches to addressing ecosystem management at the scale required through Congress. In response, Representative McLauchlan, who's a senior Democrat from Northern California on the House committee that oversees science agencies, introduced the National Wildland Fire Risk Reduction Program Act this past fall. This bill aims to improve federal efforts to reduce wildland fire risks through the establishment of a new National Wildland Fire Risk Reduction Program, which would be overseen by an interagency coordinating committee led by the Office of Science and Technology Policy, as well as the National Institute for Standards Technology. This legislation has received bipartisan support so far, but still has a very long way to go before it would become law. Similar initiatives like the National Nanotechnology Initiative and the National Quantum Initiative have helped spur interagency focus and collaboration beyond what was possible prior to the legislation. If this legislation is able to succeed, it should spur more wildfire-related research at agencies to better understand the complexities of wildfires and their impacts, as well as to inform prevention and mitigation efforts across agencies. The House is expected to advance this legislation soon as a part of their broader set of wildfire activities during what would normally be considered the traditional wildfire season. In addition, Senator Lujan, a Democrat from New Mexico, also plans to introduce a companion bill in the Senate. We do not expect the bill to be controversial there, but it's unclear whether or not this bill will be prioritized for floor time, given competing issues and priorities in the Senate. Based on the status of congressional action, there are a few recommendations to the wildfire community that we may all consider to address the second question. What can we all do to advance legislation? First, I would recommend developing a narrative to support wildfire-focused interventions that would appeal to both congressional Democrats and Republicans, especially given the likelihood of a change in leadership in Congress after this fall's elections. This could include reframing fire-related efforts as disaster response and preparedness legislation intended to increase resilience rather than focused specifically on climate change. Second, I would recommend promoting policies to effectively utilize public funds to leverage private and philanthropic investment to bring forward transformative rather than incremental solutions based on sound science. This should enable investments in both common sense solutions as well as in higher risk, high reward investments as well. The third is that I would advance recommendations that would enable members of Congress to address wildfire-related challenges that will have impacts over relatively short timescales, framing success as digestible components that will enable politicians to take credit and bring home wins to their constituents. And with that, I will turn it over to Natasha.
The second half of this is really going to focus on tech innovation, philanthropies and funding, and where we're kind of going in bringing that world and the private world, the private industry world, into the management and sort of more research space. So with that, I'm going to introduce Sean Triplett, the Tools and Technology Team Lead for the U.S. Forest Service Fire and Aviation Program, working at the National Interagency Fire Center. So Sean, take it away.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you. Okay, so what I wanted to briefly touch on today is really talking about tools and technology with the program area I'm working in. A lot of work occurring. We've heard just with the group that talked this morning about a lot of different efforts that have tools and technology in the background. We heard about research. That research ends up being turning into operational products that we use on the fire. But what I want to talk about is really all the foundational level for this work to happen is the data on the back end, and how do we get the data out to people that need it? If you're in research, if you're in a decision space, if you're the firefighter on the ground, or if you're an agency administrator tasked with working with the land and supporting the fire. So one of the things that we've really focused on at NIFC over the years is an interagency partnership, which is the website that I brought up here. It's a NIFC open data site. It's a primary effort between the Department of Interior and its bureau agencies, along with the Forest Service. And what we work to do with this website is get data available to the public and to our end users, so they can have access to it quickly for their research, for their operations, or for any of the work that they need to do. When I started in my career and over the past few years, there's been a lot of focus on wanting to build COPS, wanting to build common operating pictures, decision support tools, dashboards, a lot of these different technological innovations. But as those technological innovations mature, the one thing that they all rely on is good data in produces good products on the other side. And so really we've been trying to focus on that. Part of that data is on the standards, that the data, that we have common standards across the fire community, that we have an interoperable interagency plan to maintain and keep those standards in place. And then that the standards for data sharing, so that we can move data between systems and not have to build custom formats for that data to move around. Primary focus so far has been on kind of your vector-based GIS data and your tabular data, and that's what we've really got here. But we also have been starting to build out into the imagery and the raster space and building data standards there, so we can begin to share and move data also in those areas too. Again, rasters, as any of those in the geospatial world know, you start building raster data sets, you start building disk space, you start building storage. And again, so then how do you get out of the stovepipe storage solutions to where that data can be shared across? The other thing that we're working on is we know that no agency can go at this alone. So building partnerships for data sharing, data collection, data collaboration. And we know that's not just a federal or a state issue. We have to include our tribal partners, some of our non-traditional partners, such in the philanthropic organizations, academia, university areas, our nonprofits, working to really get across those planes, build common APIs, build out common partnerships through those relationships, so all those different pieces of data can go through. As we move forward with that, we've also have a lot of legislation that's been passed. It's kind of interesting, we're going right after the legislative affairs folks, but we've got the Dingle Act, the Infrastructure Act, the Open Data Act, recent executive order just came out of the White House, all really kind of focusing, as Jeff mentioned earlier, on that whole government or one government approach. So as the federal government and the state governments, we kind of pick up the burden for firefighting and providing the operational resources with us and our partners, but we also have that big responsibility of the data management side. So putting our efforts and focus behind getting the data out there to support everyone as quickly as we can. All these pieces of legislation are kind of our background, our driving forces to make this happen. The last thing I was going to kind of bring up in the spirit of time is to talk a little bit about some of the innovation that's occurring. We recently just had some meetings with NASA and NOAA and some of our other, I would say, non-traditional fire partners, and seeing how the fire community can begin to work with and leverage these agencies that bring expertise to the table that we just don't carry in the fire agencies. Yes, we have research and development programs, and yes, we have a lot of technology development that's occurring, but these other different entities that are coming in bring in different perspectives, different viewpoints, and different capabilities. And so the question that comes to mind then is as we build these programs, how can we then go and take what's something that's in a technology and development or a research and development program and transfer that into an operational space? So part of that transferring into an operational space is building the hosting and the platform for allow that technology to come in, building the foundation data that comes in and having those data standards in place. So as the technology is used and adopted, the data is common across the landscape. And I think most importantly is kind of the human factor at the end, which is the education. So all of these technologies, all these new data sets, all these new analysis that are occurring, that all has to get into the hands of our end users. So again, the firefighters on the ground, the decision makers, but there's also an educational component. So they understand where the data came from, how they can use it, and what can it do to help them make more efficient, I don't want to say better decisions, but improve their decision processes. So we're starting those discussions with our traditional NWCG partners, National Wildfire Coordinating Group, on how we can begin incorporating technology and the associated data with that technology into our basic firefighter training. So as we have the new generation of firefighters come in, they're from the ground up, they have the best firefighting practices, they have their all the safety and everything that goes along with that. But when they're making those risk-based decisions, they know what the data is, they can understand it, and they can learn to use it to help them do their jobs in the future. So I'll keep it short for you.
And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Genevieve Biggs, the Special Projects Officer at Moore Foundation, who's been doing a phenomenal job coordinating the foundations and philanthropic interests to make sure that their investments are additive to all of these existing efforts. So Jenny, if you want to take it away.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for bringing all of us back together. And hello to everybody out there in Zoom land. I am so honored to be included with this group and to have just a few moments to speak from a philanthropic funder's perspective, having seen so much promise and progress over the last year and recognizing that there's still so much more to do. By way of quick introduction to those of you that I haven't met before, I work at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and we are a grant-making organization started by the co-founder of Intel and Fairchild Semiconductor before that, Gordon, and his wife, Betty, with their vision of creating positive outcomes for future generations. And the vast majority of our grant making is allocated to our environmental conservation and science programs. And we have a limited amount of flexible funding alongside those major programmatic interests that allows us to support things that can reduce threats to or increase the impact of those programs. And for us, addressing this topic of wildfire really serves a dual purpose. On the one hand, neutralizing a major threat to environmental conservation, and on the other, advancing science, technology, and innovation. So with a small portfolio of grants, we've been focused on what we've learned and still need to learn about this changing fire regime we're facing and what to do about it, knowing that we need to move to a healthier coexistence with fire and wanting to achieve an outcome of wildfire resilience across Western North America. So the three lessons that I'd share come from discussions with other funders and with our grantees. And I have to say, I'm heartened by the resonance with everything that we've already heard today and hope that it's equally motivating and inspiring for everybody who's listening. The first two are really about the importance of co-funding and complementarity. And then the third is about how critical co-development is. So I'll expand on those. And first, just in wildfire now, it didn't take us very long to learn that philanthropic capital is dwarfed by public wildfire spending. So we look for places where philanthropic investment is needed to fill gaps and advance wildfire resilience because of the unique function that it can play. And my boss, Moore Foundation President Harvey Feinberg, talks about philanthropy as society's venture capital. And that's for three reasons. First, because we can deploy resources relatively quickly. And second, at the same time, we can do that with a long-term view because we don't have to respond to shareholders or file 10Qs. We don't have to worry about electoral cycles. So we can support long-term projects where staying the course is going to make a really big difference. And then finally, we're able to take strategic risks because we have the ability to support projects that may be early stage enough to be uncertain in their return on investment, but still really promising as far as impact if they succeed. So higher risk, but higher gain. And for these reasons, we need to be targeting areas where philanthropy can add relatively small but flexible dollars that can leverage and function in a complementary way to the billions that are now pouring in from federal and state sources, as we're just hearing. Then the second lesson, I would say within the philanthropic funding community, we've also seen how important it is that we work really closely together in a coordinated way. And I know it's not news to anyone who's out there listening that this is a complex topic with many different timescales, different geographies, different actors who all bring their own perspectives. So the last thing that's needed is to throw in additional layers of complexity. And when it comes to helping fund development of decision support tools and other solutions, the intended end users, at least in my experience, may be heroic in their seemingly unlimited energy and capacity to tackle this challenge, but we also know they do not have unlimited time. And we recognize that philanthropy really isn't going to be advancing wildfire resilience in any useful way if we're simply supporting duplicative, siloed efforts. So while each funder brings their own objectives and strategies, we're working to streamline our efforts and to try to stay well coordinated. That's the only way that we can make sure we aren't inadvertently adding even more complexity to a really noisy and multifaceted challenge. And then the third lesson, I would just emphasize something that we have heard loud and clear from the beginning from our grantees, and that is how critically important co-development is, making sure that those intended end users, especially for decision support tools, are informing the conversation about what gets created and even imagined from the very beginning. And the same is true for the communities that are the intended beneficiaries of any solutions. If those groups aren't engaged from the start, solutions are going to miss the mark, and uptake and adoption are going to be hampered. So this point about co-development comes up in every conversation and was a cross-cutting theme throughout a two-day meeting that we just had a few weeks ago for the community of Moore Foundation wildfire grantees. And to transition to the second question we were asked to think about, what we've learned and what we're going to do about it, I guess I'd put a plug in for a couple of resources. And first, on the points about funder complementarity and coordination, I would point to a recent report put out by Wonder Labs, and I can put a link in the chat when I'm not speaking. But the wonder behind Wonder Labs, Anna Kuhl and Shafali Lukina, are out there on participant land. I saw their faces. So the State of Fire Tech report that they produced aims to review progress, identify gaps, and provide a visioning framework to really guide philanthropic, corporate, and impact investments in wildfire risk management. And it's an example of the way that wildfire funders are collaborating and trying to build on conversations like this one today. Then second, having just had this opportunity to hear from all of our grantees last month, we're going to be publishing a report on their collective progress and the challenges that they're facing and the priorities that they as a group would highlight. And we've grouped those into a few themes, including things that won't surprise you all after the conversations today, but including a call for greater government, agency, and philanthropic coordination, as well as a continued push for data infrastructure and knowledge sharing. But above all, the group talked about the importance of this all of government, all actor, unified vision and consensus strategy for how we're going to get to resilient fire-prone communities and healthy fire-adapted ecosystems. And I know Jeff Rupert touched on this progress in his comments earlier. That vision and strategy need to be informed by sound science and traditional knowledge, and from our perspective, with a really clear and measurable outcome articulated. as well as nested indicators so that we can track our collective progress and manage adaptively over time. So last comment for now, just building on the lessons that we have learned so far. We know this needs to happen through buy-in and engagement from government, especially fire and forest personnel, from the private sector, and then from those who are on the ground getting the work done and living with fire. So it's not an easy task, but it's a really important one. And I'm so grateful for everybody who's joined today. And I'm out of time, so I'll leave it there for now, but I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Jenny. And it's really reassuring because I think we're hearing all the panelists start to converge around the same ideas and topics. And that's really exciting because that's really where we can start to make progress. So thanks so much, Jenny. Our next speaker is Anne Bartuska, the Senior Contributing Scientist with Environmental Defense Fund. And Anne, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Natasha. And if you could pull up my slides, I'll get right to it. And while she's doing that, I am an ecosystem ecologist who has spent most of my career with the federal government, mostly with the Forest Service and some with USDA. And really pleased to be part of this project with EDF and a host of others, and thinking through how we can be addressing early detection of wildfire and some approaches that are being discussed right now. This is not final. Next slide, please. And just to start, and from the context setting, even though we began our conversations for this project thinking about the California wildfires of last year, we very quickly, and this map from Copernicus shows that it was a remarkable year in the extent of fire occurring, significant ecosystem as well as cultural impact fires around the world. And so to the extent that we move forward with this project, that we're sort of affectionately calling FireSat, even as I mentioned as a wildland fire study. It's taking this global view and being very conscious of the methodologies that we pursue would have broader impact in other places, or as much impact in other places. So the next slide, please. And there's going to be more slides here and information than I will talk to, but I felt since this will be available, all of the those of you who are participating will have this as background. So our basic goal is really to improve fire forecasting and to be able to develop technologies that might better enable us to both have early detection of wildfires as well as the response and the movement of those fires across the landscape in a real-time sense that is helpful to the operations side of the equation. Next slide. And as I mentioned, this is in a scoping process, but we're recognizing that, as everyone has said, we're operating in a really complex information shed, if you will, of many different organizations who've been looking at this topic, bringing information and resources to bear, and bringing especially, I think, attention to what are the possible outcomes that are important as we move forward. And so as we've looked at both the studies that have been out there produced, for example, from UNEP, the recent UNEP report that came out earlier this year, as well as here in the United States, the 10-year strategy to address the wildfire crisis, being able to identify on the ground more quickly where these fires are and to be able to respond to them seems to be just a critical first stage. And so what we have brought forward through some of this evaluation of the literature as well as communication is looking at satellite imagery as a way to move that needle forward and to be able to again be able to better look at where we would have early ignition, as well as being able to track the spread in a more effective spatial and temporal way than perhaps we are doing now. But the key to this is it's great if we're doing it theoretically, but what we really want to be able to do is be relevant to the operations side of the equation, to those who are actually trying to manage and to make decisions about where these fires are. Next slide, please. So that's really been perhaps the most intensive effort that we've been engaging in, is identifying both the user community out there, and many of you are on the line right now. In fact, I know many of you we have talked to already, but also to be able to really listen to not just based on our own assumptions about what technology is needed, but really what do you need for making those decisions. Next slide, please. We've tried to make it very strategic in the way we do that, understanding what says here, the stakeholder landscape, not only the active firefighters, but also those who are engaged in communicating about potential fire, as well as getting the information, the technology in place, the research community that is trying to build its own capacity. How can all of this be help to making those efforts very productive as we go into the future? And so putting our time into appropriately in user input, community outreach, having these conversations to better understand what is the key need for current operational systems, as well as looking into the future as the intensification of wildfires continues. Next slide, please. And just quickly, we've talked to a lot of people and it's not over. So any of you who we have not spoken to, let us know, and we'll definitely get you on in the queue for both conversations in person and by our famous Zoom. And I also want to point out that we have very early on identified an opportunity to work in Australia with Minderoo, and acknowledging that they have become a really important cooperator of ours as we develop this overall approach. Next slide, please. As we've looked at the users, we're trying to segment it into the relevant groups and better understanding what is the need out there, what exists currently. So if you can see this, and apologize for those of you who might be a little colorblind, the green is well understood from the standpoint of what is needed. And the red is a near-term focus. We've increasingly recognized the importance of the carbon balance with regard to fires. And even as we are building carbon sequestration potential, the potential loss of that material, especially with the big megafires and some of these critical geographic areas, becomes even more powerful. And so being able to, again, slice and dice the users, the stakeholders, the amount of information that is understood versus what is needed is helping us, again, continue to inform the approach that we take. Next slide, please. And I'm not going to go through this. It'll be there as a resource. But what we have learned, and we heard this over and over again, is it's not as much about getting the data and improving the data, although that would be important, but it is this gap between getting the data and then translating it and transferring it to the user more quickly. That really is the critical need. Being able to, as one colleague said, reduce the time from data to information to getting it into your hands from 2 hours to 15 minutes would be an ideal situation. So we're acutely aware that as we move forward, this data distribution problem, this ability to do the translation, to that last mile, if you will, has become more and more part of our challenge. And there are technology aspects to that, but there's also social and just human interactions that have to be considered as part of that overall path forward, which takes me to my last slide. And that is our path forward. We're still in the scoping stage. We are starting to build upon what we have learned from, as I've indicated here, frontline people, incident command, the predictive modelers who I know from personal experience are continuing to refine the fire spread models that are out there in terms of spatial and temporal heterogeneity, and climate scientists. These are major users that we're looking to get increased guidance from. It's helping them inform the next stage, which is what is the requirements that are needed that would then translate into technology of whatever one sort or another. It might be in terms of improved sensor design, but it could also be better AI in terms of being able to translate that information. This is still a work in progress. I think we've made some really good progress in reaching out to the right folks, but we are still partway through this overall scoping effort to be able to create something that is useful, dynamic, and hopefully we can continue to build from those folks who really need to have the right information to make the best decisions they can. And so with that, I'll stop and thank you, Natasha, for this invitation once again.
Thanks so much, Anne. And our final speaker is Matt Weiner, the CEO and co-founder of the United States Megafire Response Group.
Thank you so much. I feel so lucky because so many of our great panelists covered a lot of the things that we're very excited about at USMR. And yeah, just looking forward to working with everybody going forward. So I am Matt Weiner, CEO and co-founder of a brand new organization called United States Megafire Response. We are planning to launch in June, so I am serious when I mean we are brand new. And our goal is pretty simple. We're going to be focused on ending the megafire crisis in the United States through a number of mechanisms. My experience is over the last 15 years, I've worked in Congress, and most recently, I was executive director of California's Democratic delegation in Congress. And in that role, I worked for the chair, Zoe Lofgren, where I worked on the science bill that Rebecca mentioned before, and advised Speaker Pelosi and our 40 other members of the delegation on issues of statewide importance, of which fire took an increasingly large chunk of my time over the years. And one of the things I noted during that job was that there was really not enough of a constituency for success in the fire community for members of Congress who are trying to work in the space and other policymakers elsewhere, that there was not a lot of coordination and that the message was not quite right. And the basic premise is that not enough people understood that megafires in particular are solvable, and that we therefore have an obligation to solve this problem, and we can do it. It seems pretty straightforward to me. It was not straightforward to a lot of policymakers. There's a lot of climate fatalism that happens in this community where everyone mentions that, well, because climate change and drought are getting forever worse, we're not going to be able to do anything about this problem unless we fix climate and drought. And my feeling was that it's actually quite the opposite. Climate change is only going to get worse if we don't solve this problem, and we can. So I left the Hill last month and came together with a group of folks, including George Whitesides and Kate Dargan, who many of you know, and we're putting together US Megafire Response with a goal of focusing on a number of areas. First, forestry policy. We want to totally change the way we talk about and work on forest policy in the United States and get much more aggressive about improving forest health, hazardous fuels mitigation, and all the other matters there, including improving and giving the Forest Service the resources that it needs to do the job before it. And then the other component is the wildfire science piece, which is something that Natasha asked me to speak about. And we zeroed in on these two areas when there is so much in this space that needs to get done from a policy perspective, because we think that those two areas are critical to solving this problem. And we also think that those two areas are not that the needs in those areas are not going to get met without a concerted push. And so we wanted to focus there. When we get into the science piece, we're looking at, one of the things that struck me, and I think that a lot of folks on this call are very familiar with, is the fact that the American scientific community and the federal science agencies in particular are not fully focused on this problem. We have really great people. Sean's an absolute legend in the work that he does. We have really great people that are doing great work in this space, but there's no deliberate federal strategy. And though there are really good efforts to stand them up, that where we see things happening in different federal science agencies, it tends to be that there's one really good person who has an idea, finds a pot of money, is working with it. And so we want to work to make these things much more deliberate and much more outcome focused across the board, and make sure everyone's talking to each other and working together. So to that end, I think one of the things that has come up with me a lot is that a lot of policymakers do not see wildfire science and the needs there as critical to the solution. A lot of them see it as a sideshow, as an afterthought. So while every time we get a major hurricane, the disaster supplemental that follows up with it has a bunch of money for NOAA for hurricane prediction and tracking, over the years, we haven't seen the same dynamic in the fire community. And so we believe that we need to get fires to be treated with the same focus that we've had on other disasters, and have all of the agencies brought into the fold. And it needs to be seen as critical. Not only are we, do we need to do this, we're not going to solve this problem if we don't do a better job, excuse me, of tracking, modeling, detecting fires in real time, of harnessing agencies like NIST to improve our building standards in the WUI, of improving our understanding of fire weather through investments at NOAA and other agencies across the board. So our goal as an organization is going to be pushing the Lofgren bill. We're going to be pushing the appropriations efforts that we're seeing in the House and in the Senate right now to increase funding for a lot of these science programs with an eye towards mitigation, prevention, and yes, suppression where necessary in terms of putting out bad fires, but with an ultimate goal of making sure that we put the fire community in a position to make a decision on what fires can be allowed to burn, what fires can't, what need to be suppressed right away, and just increasing our awareness across the board in this space. And so we're going to be doing that through inside lobbying, inside game, go and give offices the support they need. And I think one thing that Jeff mentioned is there's a growing awareness in the public that we need to do much more to solve this problem. The problem is getting worse faster than the solutions are coming, right? And that we need to do something about that. I think policymakers actually understand that right now. We're at a moment where there's a huge opportunity and we get that, but they don't know quite how to get there, and they don't know how to think outside the box quite yet on what that fully entails. And so we have a lot of internal education work to do and a lot of policy formation to do to help them put together the policies we need across the entire government and not just in the Forest Service and DOI, even though they have to be the critical players in this at the federal level, obviously. And so we intend to do that. And then we intend to also be involved in a public affairs side of this, which is telling people that this problem needs to be solved, that this is that climate fatalism is not the answer here, that we actually have a lot of agency to fix this problem, and therefore policymakers need to do it. And so the consequences of that kind of a campaign would be twofold. One is it means voters will actually demand change from their policymakers. And two, the policymakers who are doing great things right now, I think a lot of folks would be surprised at how lonely they feel, right? They feel like they push really big really good bills into the bipartisan infrastructure law or into Build Back Better, even though it didn't get into law last year. And it's kind of met with a shrug, even in communities that are really impacted by fire. And that was something that was really surprising to me. And so, our goal is going to be to show that there is a constituency for success, that we do want to support the wins that are having in this space, with an eye towards encouraging more folks to get involved and to focus on solving this problem. So I look forward to working with all you on the call and, looking forward to our launch in the next couple of weeks here. And thank you so much for having me, Natasha.
This is for Rebecca and Matt. Who are our current champions in Congress?
I can take the first stab at that. I don't know if Rebecca was about to chime in. On the science and technology front, it's going to be Zoe Lofgren, Suzanne Bonamici out of Oregon is really great on this. Ed Perlmutter out of Colorado is fantastic. In the Senate, Senator Padilla out of California, Ben Ray Lujan from New Mexico, Jackie Rosen is showing a lot of interest in this space. And of course, Joe Neguse and a couple others have been really focused on it as well.
And just to feed on that, Rebecca, I'd love to hear what you have to say as well. But can you say something about how they think about it, or what is it specifically that they're championing? Anyways, you know what I'm trying to say. So Rebecca, I'll let you answer.
Well, so actually, I'll let Matt answer that because I think he's worked directly with many of those people that I may not have worked with directly.
Yeah, I mean, excuse me. As far as what specifically they're championing, Natasha?
Yeah, exactly.
You made me think about that word too much.
Say it 3 times fast.
Yeah, so there's a range of things, right? So you've got some members on, and this is kind of how this is one of the problems that we're facing in this community, right? Is traditionally the members of Congress who've been really engaged on this have been members of the Agriculture Committee and the Natural Resources Committees, or Energy and Water in the Senate. And that's great. I think when you look at a lot of the people who are more familiar with science policy, they tend to sit on other committees. They tend to sit on Commerce, Justice, Science, and the Appropriations Committee. They tend to sit on the Commerce Committee or the Science and Technology Committee, right? And so a lot of those members that I mentioned are focusing on it through that lens, though there's still a lot of other members who focus at the traditional lens. So if you look at Padilla, Lofgren, and Ben Ray Lujan, they're focused to bring all of the federal science agencies outside of Interior and Forest Service into the fold here, and wanting to do that in a way that's effective for the system, and making sure that we're focused on getting all of America's scientific community engaged in this fight in a way that's productive.
I want to focus on this question about how does NSF and agencies take advantage of SBIR? So recognizing that, I think one of the challenges that was brought up at the Keck Institute for Space Studies workshop a year ago was, how do we build sustainable business models for the solutions that we're creating? And Jenny, I think, you can also probably speak to something about how the philanthropies are thinking about investing to bridge this gap between where public and private dollars are. But I would love to hear from Kendra or Paul, and maybe Jenny, if you have any thoughts on this and the role of private sector and businesses.
I'm happy to start.
Great.
Go ahead, Kendra. I was just going to, from the philanthropic perspective, I think, one of the points that I had made earlier was that it's so clear that philanthropic dollars, all told in aggregate, are still just a tiny drop in the bucket relative to what's needed and what's available from the private sector and from the public sector. So I think generally from a philanthropic perspective, what I think that we're well positioned to do is to help catalyze some ideas and accelerate some ideas, get them started. And once they're proven and de-risked, then hopefully the idea of sustainable financing comes in from public dollars or from the private sector. So typically in the sort of philanthropic circles, I think that's where most of us are oriented. But I'll turn it over to Kendra.
Yeah, well, this is a great question. I myself don't know too much about the history of those two programs at NSF, the SBIR and STTR programs, but I do know that those two programs have just been moved into the new directorate, the new TIP directorate that rolled out like in March, and they're being renamed America's Seed Fund. And so I think there's a real push at NSF to, I believe our new director calls it something like speed up the innovation cycle and kind of move foundational research through this phase that SBIR has been typically very helpful at funding to move it through those phases more quickly. So I'll put that into the chat, and maybe someone else can interpret what's really needed out there in that private sector better than I can.
Excellent. Recognizing that we're almost at time, I do want to bring this back to some of the interagency management and coordination for Paul and Jeff and Sean maybe. So how should we address total suppression policies, or the 10 a.m. rule that are common and that contribute to the wildfire paradox? So, we know that we have this legacy suppress fires, firefighters, we heard about it from Rebecca. A lot of the money is going to firefighters, which is about stopping fires. And Jeff, as you mentioned, we're extremely effective at it. And that's part of what got us here. And so how should we address that? Or, what are agencies doing to start changing the narrative there?
I mean, I'll jump in with a thought or two. And so to be clear, there is no 10 o'clock rule anymore. However, for those who pay attention, I mean, you definitely see that, as nationally as we get into the most active periods of wildfire response, you saw this last year. For sure, there was quite a public facing, I don't know if that's exactly the right term, but engagement on it. You do see additional guidance being put in place that definitely pushes in the direction of aggressive response. I think the sort of the foundational rationale behind that is pretty easy to understand, you know, in terms of impacts to people and concern and risk, and you know how that circumstance plays out. You know, the solution to that, I can tell you from a role like mine, this is a really challenging engagement, because there's real impacts to real people in real communities, and there's real science and real ecology, and you know how fire naturally interacts with fire adapted systems. You know, we're in such a sort of unbalanced place that, you know, that sort of natural interaction is you know, kind of problematic. I think, you know, education, the more science we can bring, the more we can objectively show that realistically there is no such thing as no fire, and that there are choices to be made and there are trade-offs to recognize between essentially, you know, managing how we interact with fire versus being in a circumstance where, you know, we have megafires and we're getting, you know, these impacts that are essentially beyond our control and beyond our ability to sort of influence. You know, I think we just need to keep talking about it. We need to keep bringing as much objective perspective as we can to that discussion, and educate. Bring social science in.
Just a couple of quick points on that. I think it's a great question. There's a lot of people that maybe are frustrated by it, but on the other hand, there's a lot of risk to the people, to the incident commanders, the agency administrators that have to make a decision of suppression or not suppressing. There is an important role that science can help. One is, for instance, help planning, use science to plan where you put fuel treatments to improve your ability, or fire response teams to be able to put control lines in to manage, to box the fire in, to manage it with reducing the risk of it escaping or getting out to communities. The other part of it is using some of the advanced fire behavior coupled, atmospheric coupled models that are more mechanistic, physics derived, and better at modeling fire behavior, so that you can use them and do Monte Carlo simulations to find out what are the operating environments, the environmental prescriptions that will let you let the fire burn more and still safely maintain the control lines on it. There is a lot of risk, as we've seen in New Mexico this past couple of weeks. There's a lot of risk with prescribed fire and managing fire response. So we do have tools available, but it takes a pretty big investment to be able to utilize it, both from treatment as well as better understanding what fires are going to do.